If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. On this episode, I'm going to talk about the fact that most people don't know how to process incoming information. And it's okay, it's just not something that we're taught. We might pick it up, bits and pieces. We probably have a process, but maybe our process is not ideal just because we haven't had enough experience with different systems or we haven't thought very carefully about how to do it. We just sort of do it the same way everybody else does it. And I would suggest that that's not perhaps the most effective process for doing it. Now, when we talk about, maybe you haven't even thought about it, processing incoming information, that sounds really formal, or it sounds really, I don't know, like something some specialist would do or something, but we all do it. We live in an information world, and so we process information. And it's a core part of personal information management. And when we talk about personal information management, particularly for knowledge workers, is a critical part of modern economic life. Again, there's so much information. And the ways that we receive information are continuing to change. They're both coming up with new ways for us to receive information. And the amount of information and level of awareness that the business and culture expect of us, both are increasing. So business, your job, the people that you work with expect you to be able to manage more incoming information. And the culture generally, your friends, your family are expecting you to be able to process more information as it's incoming. I did a podcast on this a little while back where we talked about information overload, and information overload is just filter failure. And I think that's part of it. I think if we have good filters and we only see the information that is important to us, then that's very helpful. But even then, we don't live in an information vacuum, and we do need to process incoming information well. And so that's what we're going to walk through on this episode. Lots of people out there are trying this on their own. They're trying to get their stuff in better shape on their own. And I would say that most of my customers, in fact, I guarantee the overwhelming majority of my customers, have tried to do it yourself. They've tried to learn it themselves. And it's an immense challenge, both from a technical perspective, but also from a motivational perspective, because in order for this stuff to work, we have to behave differently. And behaving differently means changing habits. Changing habits is hard. And so we need help. We need accountability. We need reminding, those kinds of things. And that's why this works very well as a coached piece of work. So if you want to talk to me about coaching, hit me up on LinkedIn or contact me, Larry@dobusyright.com, and we'll talk about it. There are several different options. My current favorite right now is to have cohorts of folks that are going through a remote class. And it takes 8 weeks to do that, and it's really not a huge investment. So that's one way. So it doesn't have to be one-to-one with me. But there are multiple ways that we can do it. So if you're interested in getting some support on fixing up this part of your work life and your life, give me a shout. So here we go. Let's get into it. So first, we want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say incoming information. And you probably can take a pretty good stab at what it is just because of what I've already said. So the culture, other people, our environment sends us information. Whether it's passively doing it or actively doing it is kind of an odd question. So I won't belabor the point, but a lot of people do shout at us. Sometimes the environment shouts at us. But a lot of the information that comes to us comes because we reach out for it with our senses and we go get it. In addition, we reach out with our computers and we go get certain information. And so incoming just means that it's not present with us right now. Okay, that it's not within our own existing information store, or perhaps it is and we just haven't found it, so we had to go search for it again. It's when you get into that, it's a little bit complicated, but incoming just means it's at me and I feel the need to do something with it or about it. And that information is usually in the form of some messaging, but we're talking really about anything. We're talking about visual information. When we look at something, we're talking about things we hear, words from other people, words from our devices that we hear, even touch, taste, or information. But the biggies are what we see and what we hear. And when we do that, we want to have that information and we want to be able to do something with it. And what we wind up doing, I'll call capture. So we see information and we want to keep it somehow. And we've learned as humans that our brains are not terribly reliable for this sort of memory. And so we tend to want to have our own copy of information. Whether that's a physical copy that's actually in your possession, or whether it's a digital copy that is digitally in your possession, we tend to want to have a copy. Now, is that necessary? Could the problem be more easily solved if we didn't feel like we had to keep a piece of information, keep a copy of the information we see? Maybe. Maybe we could just record who knows what, and we could ask them every time. That would probably not be real acceptable socially. I've told you that before and you've forgotten it. If you think that maybe I'm wrong, maybe you should ask your spouse what their birthday is and see what their response is. So others expect us to have possession of certain information. And this is one of the ways that we show that we care about them, is that we know things about them. It's part of a relationship. So we feel this need to possess information of our own, so to speak. And so we tend to write it down. We tend to keep copies of books, and some people will journal, and we like to have copies of email in case we get in trouble and we can pull out the email and say, you told me to. And so for all those reasons, we like to have copies of that information. So when it comes into us, usually just observing it is not sufficient, but we also want to make some sort of a record of it. Sometimes that record is just a memory. Other times that record is a tangible thing, either a physically tangible thing or a computer piece file. So incoming information. Now, one of the things that's interesting about incoming information is that there are a huge variety of different sources for information. And we kind of ran through this a little bit, but all of the different ways that information comes at us, I refer to those things as information channels. just to distinguish one from the other because they're not all the same. Now they do, because they're information channels, they carry information. But if we start talking about them as discrete channels, then we can say certain things about how they vary and how they're different. And that helps us understand how we can best deal with the incoming information. Because in some ways, dealing with the incoming information, how to deal with it is dictated by the shape it comes to us in. And that's a property usually of the channel. So we talk about different channels. And that way we can both talk about differences and we can have different processes for different kinds of channels, but also so that we can perhaps deal with some channels and ignore some channels. And there's a real good property of information channels there that we can make great use of. So we'll talk about that as we get into it. So information comes to us, and it comes to us through channels. Now, you may have guessed that information also, we publish or broadcast information. We send information out. Outbound information also goes through channel. And we'll deal with that another time. But for now, let's just think about incoming information. Then let's think about the different channels that are available and have different properties for how the information gets to us. So I said you probably don't know how to do this. Here's a thought experiment to demonstrate what I mean. Let's say your boss comes to you and says, hey, I found a genie in a bottle, and I'm going to point the genie at you, and the genie is going to stop time for 30 minutes. Everything on the planet's going to stop except you. So you've got 30 free minutes, and I'm giving this to you because I want you to get your email straightened out. Now, as part of the deal, you got 30 minutes. You can deal with email. You can't do anything else. If you start doing something else, the 30-minute clock collapses and you're back in real time. 30 minutes to deal with your email. The thought experiment is, what's your plan? What plan pops into your head? Oh, I'm about to do 30 minutes of step 1, step 2, step 3, rinse, repeat. What am I going to do? Now, the interesting part is most people would say something like, oh, I'm going to answer all those emails and get to the bottom of my list. And they may even use some jargon like inbox 0. Spoiler alert, that is not a great answer. To say we're going to answer all the emails and get to the bottom of my list, A, is not specific. It's not a specific process. B, not all emails are answerable. And we'll talk about 2 primary kinds of information. And then you may empty the channel or you may not, but it's going to be really hard to do in any period of time. And you can't keep it empty. Now, I do believe in inbox 0, and I can do inbox 0 just about any time I choose. Right now, there's probably 4 or 5 emails in each of my 3 email boxes. I have 3 different email addresses that I manage. And I can get to inbox 0 anytime I choose. So what we're going to do then, if that was your answer, you really don't have a process for doing it. And if you don't have a process for doing something, and I say this a lot, then it's hard to test, experiment, and get better at what you're doing. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about process. Also, you probably guessed, you could substitute any communication channel that you want to for email in this thought exercise. And you probably still don't have a process. Okay. And so that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to think through. So there are some parts of the process that are common across all information channels. And there are other parts of the process that are specific to specific kinds of information channels. So we'll walk through all of that sort of thing. Okay. But that's our thought experiment. So just be honest with yourself. Okay. And don't brush this off, because if you could do it, you would find that it's a great skill to have. So off we go. So first we need to think through some general ideas about channels. So for any channel, when we talk about dealing with a channel, ideally what we mean is that we would go to the channel, we would open it, we would empty it, and we would close it, and then move on with our lives. We don't need to spend all of our lives paying attention to incoming information unless we have very specific jobs. And we're not very good at spending our entire lives exposed to incoming information because we're humans. So the basic approach is once in a while, you go to the channel, you open it, you take all the stuff out of it, you close it, and we call this processing the channel, just to have a word for it. So when we say process an information channel, that's what we mean. We mean get to it, whatever that means. It might mean walking out to your mailbox, open it, get the stuff out of it, close it, and go about your business. Okay. Now, naturally, phase 2 of processing is to deal with the stuff that you took out. And we've talked about that a lot. And we'll talk about the step that gets us there. But for now, we're just talking about open it, empty it, close it. Now, one of the key things that many people have not thought through in terms of information channels is that all information channels are at least capable of carrying two different kinds of information. There are two basic kinds of information that are useful for us to understand. And all information channels are capable of carrying both kinds. The two types are reference information and actionable information. And their names, they do what's on the tin. Actionable information is information that when you see it, indicates to you that there's something that you need to do or something that needs to be done about that information. And this happens to us all the time in information channels. The boss calls us on the phone and says, hey, do the thing. Right? Spouse calls us on the phone at work and says, hey, pick up the milk. Okay. Kids come screaming through the window. Oh, I scraped my knee. I got an owl. So these are pieces of information in the channel that indicate to us that we need to do something. So we call that actionable information. And when we talk about actionable information, we need to do something, and we've got a pretty good idea of when we need to have it done. And it's probably in the reasonably short term. I would say up to maybe months, maybe occasionally years, but usually up to months. And quite often it's in the next few days. And unfortunately, more often than is comfortable to most of us, it's right now today. So we'll have to deal with that, but that's another part of the system that we deal with. So that's actionable information. The other kind is reference information. And reference information is information that, for whatever reason we think is important to us, we want to maintain awareness of this information, which often causes us to want to keep a copy of it. And we keep a copy of it because we think we're going to use it, but we really don't know exactly when or how we're going to use this information. So an example from my world is I see something out, an article or whatever, and I think, hey, maybe that'll make a good blog post at some point. So I pull down a copy of it and I put it in a special location where I keep that kind of information. Once in a while, I review that list as I'm trying to think through what a podcast episode might be about. But it's just some ideas. I really don't know. I typically don't say, ooh, that's next week's podcast. I typically don't do that. Other kinds of reference information, general knowledge, this kind of reference information. I have a trivia calendar because there's Christmas gifts that cost $12 and less. um, maybe a quote, right? Maybe some notes from a book you've read. So these are all kind of reference information. So actionable information and reference information. And they need to be treated at least somewhat differently. Okay. And that's really part two of processing. But I do specifically want to bring it up because actionable information on a channel can be a trap for us because we tend to want to go ahead and take that action while the channel is open. And that's formal terminology for the idea that when you go to your email and you open up your email box, and there's an email in there from somebody, you tend to want to answer it right now. That is the thing about actionable information. So I will say, and that leads us to our next thing. All channels are bad places to, one, store the information, and two, manipulate the information. The point of a channel is to make us aware of the information. And for us, if it's a two-way channel, we'll talk about that. For us to make others aware of information that we think they need to be aware of. The purpose of a channel is not to remain open while you ponder what your response is. Now, is it going to hurt anything to leave it open? Is it going to hurt anything to leave your email open? I mean, it's not going to blow things up. But what happens is, as long as the channel stays open, then we're in danger of allowing interruption to happen to us. And the chances of an interruption occurring are proportional to the length of time that the channel's open. So ideally, you want to, hey, open up the channel, information, close the channel, at least for some period of time. Okay. Now we'll talk about, there should be one or two exceptions to that, and we may be able to get to that in this episode. We'll talk about it. But channels are bad places to store information, and channels are bad places to manipulate information to actually do work, because of that tendency for interruption. And interruption is a primary enemy of good, thoughtful work. So what that means is, so the ideas that we've talked about, the open, empty it, close it idea, the idea that it's a bad place to do work and a bad place to store things, all of these together indicate that we need some other kind of storage location where we put information. So we open the channel, we get the information and put it somewhere, and then we close the channel, so that then we can, in an uninterrupted fashion, we can process the information that we got. Okay, and that needs to be another location. And interestingly enough, ideally, and I think it's required actually, but at least ideally, there is one storage location. All channels that present information to us, we go and we open them one at a time and we take out what's in there, at least metaphorically. We close the channel and we put the stuff in our one place. And that way we can deal with it effectively versus it being scattered all over a bunch of different places where we're most likely going to lose it. Okay. But that's sort of a side topic for now, but another storage location is required because of the nature of what we're trying to do with the information channels. So, as I said before, there's a bunch of different channels. It's hard, it would be hard to even count them because is talking to your boss a different channel than talking to your spouse? Okay, maybe not, I don't know, it doesn't matter. But we do know that there are some differences so that we can begin to categorize channels by these differences. Now, this is another thing that you probably have not thought through, at least exhaustively. And we're going to talk about 4.5 differences between channels. The first one is synchronous versus asynchronous. A channel is synchronous versus asynchronous. And what we mean by that is, and I've done other podcasts on this, synchronous means that you can know whether or not you've got the attention of the person you're communicating to with. Asynchronous means you cannot. Okay, so synchronous is face-to-face, Zoom. Telephone is pretty good for this, for being synchronous. Asynchronous is anything where you cannot observe the other people, either visually or through by listening to them or for them, which means email, chat. Chat's a big one because people tend to think of chat as being a synchronous communication when in fact it is not synchronous. Because you don't know whether or not you've got the other individual's attention. And if you don't have it, there's very little you can do to get it back. Okay, so synchronous versus asynchronous. There's another one that's interesting, and it correlates with synchronous versus asynchronous. And I'll say it's discrete versus continuous. And what I mean by that is there are distinct usable chunks of information on the channel, or there's one long stream of information on the channel. Now, no channel is continuous eternally. Okay. But in a period of time, discrete versus continuous. And often this has more to do with the way that channel is accessed, the technology we use to access the channel, than it does with the nature of the channel itself. A radio broadcast is continuous until you turn it off. Email is discrete because you get an email and you can manipulate it as a single object. Chat is continuous because there's not a file that you can capture from it, or, right? Snail mail is discrete because there's a countable pieces of mail. Okay. Maybe countable is a better way to think of this. And countable can be a large number, but it's at least theoretically possible to count it versus continuous where it's really not. And so those are two different things. And it's not exactly the same as synchronous versus asynchronous, but there is some high correlation among channels. Those that are synchronous are often continuous. Another difference between channels is digital versus analog. So a channel is digital if it's mediated by our information technology, and it's analog if it's not. Analog is you're watching a movie. Despite the fact that it's been digitized, it's still an analog experience, right? It's and again, sort of continuous, but a little bit different, and it's important why. Digital. So digital is things that come through the computer. And the big difference here is the ease of storage mechanisms. Okay. Our storage because of the amount of information, I'm going to say our storage has to be on a computer. Because otherwise, in physical reality, the system collapses under the weight of information as we try to record it if it's on paper. So it has to be digital. And thus, analog kinds of signals, and we're getting better at this, need to be digitized first and then stored in a digital storage location. So digital versus analog. A third one, fourth one is two-way channel versus read-only or write-only. Okay, a read-only channel, again, radio broadcast is a read-only channel, so to speak. You're not actually reading it, but it's you can't do output on it. Okay, write-only, you only do output. Publishing a book, me recording this podcast is a write-only channel. The difference here is two-way will sometimes help you with synchronous versus asynchronous, but two-way tends to also be the ones that have that trap that I talked about, where it's call and response, and we tend to want to do work in the channel because it's two-way. And we tend to think, well, I've got the channel open, I might as well use it. Well, opening channels is a matter of about a 2-second exercise. So, but anyway, two-way versus read-only or write-only. Now, another thing that can be true, this is the half. So we had 4, this is the half. That can be true about channels is they have a typical level of urgency. A channel has a typical level of urgency. And perhaps can communicate different levels of urgency within the channel. Now, I bring this up because different organizational cultures, let's say, different work cultures, different channels carry different levels of urgency. In most business cultures that have both email and chat, chat is generally viewed as more urgent, meaning the expected response time is shorter than is email. And of course, any electronic communication is more urgent than snail mail, just because of transit time and those sorts. So now that level of urgency is controllable and varies depending on your culture. And I bring it up because that's a good thing. Different channels should have different levels of urgency. And that way we can set a rhythm for checking the channels. And then we can close them in between those times. Your highest urgency channel should be always open. Now, it doesn't mean that your phone is always dialed, but it does mean that your ringer is on. Okay. It means that you will answer somebody if they knock the urgent knock on your door. Or if they shout at you, hey, the building's on fire, you will answer them. Okay. So that's this levels of urgency thing. And that's a controllable thing. And I bring it up because most people don't try to control the levels of urgency. They don't have an organizational culture piece that tells them how urgent each channel is. And so they tend to want to treat them all the same, or they want to treat them in their own particular way. And that leads to the fact that almost all of our communication channels have to be all open all the time. And that's a recipe for distraction and interruption. All right, so that's some differences between channels. And what we'll do is we'll use those differences and we'll talk about processing differences because of the differences of the nature of the channel. Okay, so baseline, let's just start with the email. For reference, so think through what is email in those 4 those 4 spectrums, those 4 measures. Synchronous versus asynchronous. Is email synchronous or asynchronous? Is email discrete versus continuous? Is email digital versus analog? And is email two-way versus read-only or write-only or one-way? My answers from the back of the book, email is asynchronous because you cannot tell when you're going to have somebody else's attention. It's discrete. Email is countable. There's an email I send you. It's digital because it originates on the computer. And it's two-way because you can send and receive. Thus, it is that trap that we tend to want to inhabit that channel versus open it, empty it, close it. Okay. Now, how do we process an email channel? And I'm going to fly over this very, very quickly. Okay. We go to the channel, we pull everything out. This probably means making a copy somehow. Okay. If you use Outlook, you can drag an email and drop it on your desktop, and it turns into a .msg file. And that way you don't have to live in that channel. You can pull out all the emails that you need to deal with and put them on your desktop, close your email, and then deal with the emails. You can even draft answers to them. And then when it's time to broadcast, you open the channel and you put all the broadcasts back into the channel, outgoing. You hit send and you close the channel. Okay, ideally, this is the way it works. So we talked about asynchronous, meaning you can't know when you're going to have somebody else's attention. And that means that your message has to be crafted differently. Emails are much longer than an associated face-to-face communication because you have to anticipate where people might not understand you and deal with those cases. Okay, that's the problem with asynchronous. It's particularly a problem if we are using an asynchronous channel, but we're fooled into thinking that it's synchronous, because that can be a huge waste of time. Well, I just sent them the text, so they're going to respond to me. Well, when do you stop expecting a response? After 5 minutes, after 10? I don't know. They may still be crafting the response. So email, that's just the baseline. So you go and you take all the emails out and you put them in the one place to rule them all. And I've talked about that in other podcasts. And then you close the channel and you process the email. You decide, is it actionable or is it reference? If it's actionable, what's the action? When am I going to take it? If it's reference, where does it live? Okay. Off we go. So we've processed the channel. Okay. Now let's look at a different channel. Let's look at a telephone channel, a voice phone channel, right? So again, back to the differences. A voice phone channel, is it synchronous or asynchronous? And I think we might have talked about this, okay? Is it discrete or continuous? Is it digital or is it analog? And finally, is it two-way or is it one-way? Okay. So a phone is synchronous. It's continuous. Those two don't always go together, but they often do. Synchronous, continuous, it's analog. Okay. And it's two-way. So the difference as compared to email that we'll deal with here is we'll deal with the synchronous nature of it. And what that means is that your communication style can be briefer, more efficient in the following way. You can check for attention and you can check for comprehension. If you can't be sure you've got somebody's attention, then checking for comprehension is a zillion times harder, because you're trying to establish two things at the same time. But since it's synchronous, you can check for attention and understanding. Does that make sense? Does what I tell you make sense? No, it doesn't. Okay, ask me a question. Versus an asynchronous channel where I have to anticipate those questions. And thus my communication is much more drawn out. It's much more complex. Synchronous. Okay. The rest, continuous, analog, two-way, are, well, we'll deal with continuous on another channel, but so we wanted to highlight the synchronous versus asynchronous difference between channels. All right, then we'll move over to chat. So, chat, synchronous or asynchronous, discrete or continuous, digital versus analog, two-way versus one-way. What did you get? Chat is asynchronous, continuous, digital, and two-way. It's continuous, which means the chat stream is not, it's hard to take a chunk out of. Okay. Again, this sounds like synchronous and they're slightly different. Okay. Because a chat channel is asynchronous, but still continuous as compared to email, which is discrete. So you can take an email and do something with it. You don't want to take an entire chat stream and do something with it. So when we're dealing with a continuous channel, we have to find discrete chunks and capture discrete chunks. Okay. Otherwise, finding the information is one of searching that is expensive. The kind of searching we have to do is very expensive. Continuous. Okay. So we want to get discrete chunks and record those. And usually this is done by taking notes or some other conversion mechanism. Taking screenshots for chat is an example. So we're chit-chatting on chat about the football game or whatever, and somebody says, hey, bring me the sandwich back from lunch. Okay, so we want to take perhaps a screenshot of that. Okay, and that goes out into our one place. Okay, because all of a sudden some actionable information just popped up. Okay, the rest of it probably wasn't even reference information. It was just relationship information. Okay, so continuous. Now, the next kind of channel is we're processing a conversation or a meeting. Okay. Now, this does have some overlap with phone, but bear with me because the thing I want to bring out here, when we talk about conversation and meeting phone channel, then we're looking at an analog versus a digital channel. Okay. Now, it's analog, meaning that it doesn't exist in any sort of a real digitally capturable form. Right. So that's why we talk about like a conversation or a meeting, a face-to-face conversation in, say, a restaurant or a meeting in a big meeting room. Okay. It's very much analog. And how do we then, because our information storage place has to be digital. We said that because a physical system, a paper system will collapse under its own weight. So it has to be digital. So our problem then becomes digitizing it. And how do we make it into something that is storable? How this is done, often the best way to do it is just have a piece of paper with you and write it down and then go back and digitize it later. Recording an entire meeting has this same problem that we talked about with continuous. If you record the entire meeting, then you have to listen to the entire meeting again, and you didn't have enough time to attend it the first time. Okay. Now, it's possible to have some technology that mediates here. But by and large, you might as well consider the fact that you have to both make it a chunk, right, and digitize it. Okay. So, maybe if you've got a recording, then you can do a transcript and you can then search the transcript with digital tools. So that's part of this thing that would need to happen as we're getting the information out of this channel and putting it away. Okay, so that's where analog shows up. And then our last channel that we'll talk about on this difference is a blog channel. I wanted to bring up a blog channel because a blog channel is, I'm going to say asynchronous, discrete. There's one blog post at a time. They're countable. It's digital because it's delivered that way. And the interesting part here is that it tends to be one way. Okay. Now it's one way to you, even if I am doing an interview with a guest on my show. It's still one way to you. Okay. And it's one way from me by the time it's recorded and put here. Okay. So this blog channel tends to be a one-way channel. All right. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you're less likely to get trapped in the doing of something about what I say. and not paying attention to what I'm saying. Less likely. It still happens. Okay. And there are other challenges of that. But it's a one-way channel. Reading a book is a one-way channel. And what that means is you want to be careful because you can't ask questions very easily. You may have to go back and listen to a snippet of the channel again. I'm told that if you have Apple TV, you can say, "Hey Siri, what did he say?" And it'll rewind the TV 10 seconds, turn on the captions, and replay that bit. And then after it does that, the captions go away and it just continues. Okay. That's great. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do that in meetings? So, but one way has that property. It's not, I mean, it's not that it's not interruptible, it's just that it's not interactive. Okay. So we've walked through this a little bit, and a lot of this, I think, in and of itself was probably helpful for you. So we know that we have to have different ways of processing. We talked very briefly about how to process different kinds of channels with different properties, what to think about there. Processing is a major component. It's a major workflow in the Attention Compass package. It's one of the 4 workflows. And so we do go in depth into how to do it. And in many cases, once you understand that you need to process, the processing itself becomes pretty instinctive. And just therefore understanding and beginning to categorize and having an approach towards these different information channels so that you're not surprised when you're faced with one and you struggle then to make value of the information that's on that channel. So we've covered that difference across those 4 properties. I think those are important. We talked about the general approach to dealing with channels. We defined what channels are. So we'll recap just a couple of the more detailed points. So we did the thought experiment. Do you have a process? And my guess is that you probably don't. Don't let that make you feel bad. We aren't trained in this stuff. It's not like you failed a class in school because the class doesn't exist. Okay. So we probably don't have a process. If we do have a process, then it might not be nuanced enough to handle the different kinds of properties of information channels. So we talked about general ideas about channels. The basic approach to every channel is open it, empty it, close it. And we call that processing the channel. We talked about every channel is capable of carrying 2 basic kinds of information: actionable information, reference information. That's important because it has to do with how we then store the information. We said that all channels are bad places to store both kinds of information, and all channels are bad places to do work, to do the thinking part. And what that means is don't open your email channel, open an email, and try to give a 20-minute response to a complex question because you'll get interrupted. And it's that interruption and that task switching that causes the inefficiency. And we said, because of those 2 things, channels are bad places to store information and they're bad places to do work. Another storage location is required. We said that should be digital. It has to be on the computer, otherwise it's going to collapse under its own weight because of its physical reality. So we talked about differences between channels. We talked about synchronous versus asynchronous. We talked about the fact that synchronous, you can check for attention, which means you can check for comprehension. We talked about discrete versus continuous. Discrete means it comes to us in chunks that are countable and tends to make it easier to deal with. So we pull that chunk out of the channel and we deal with it, versus continuous, which is a little bit trickier there. Okay. We talked about digital versus analog because analog needs to be digitized somehow. Okay. And then we talked about two-way versus read-only, write-only. And the big deal there is two-way, both sides at least have the opportunity to clarify. Now, particularly a two-way synchronous channel. Okay, I'm not sure that there would be any one-way synchronous channels, but that's for another episode. Two-way synchronous means that we can both check for attention, comprehension. We can both ask questions and get answered. We can both refine what we're talking about. And that's the overwhelming value of a synchronous two-way channel. People say, oh, well, face-to-face is better than. I would say face-to-face and Zoom are much better. Phone is somewhat better. And then everything else that I can think of off the top of my head is in distant third place. Because that we use the word richness when we talk about channels, communication channels. And what we mean is that ability to say, hey, wait a minute, I didn't catch what you said. Or to say, hey, did you understand what I meant? And that way we can be more effective in our communication there. Talked about 5 different kind of channels. Email is a baseline channel for me. It's pretty easy to deal with, and it's one that almost all of us cut our teeth on in terms of electronic delivery of information. Right. Now we're getting into a generation where the first thing people use is chat, and it will become the reference. And then we'll still talk about email, but we'll say, okay, well, we'll deal with chat first. And we'll say, oh, well, email is kind of an asynchronous, discrete chat. Right. Or I'm sorry, a discrete chat. Yeah, discrete. So we talked about email, talked about phone, because phone is synchronous. Okay, we can check for understanding, we can ask questions. We talked about chat because it's continuous. It doesn't come in discrete little packets. We talked about a conversation or meeting, a face-to-face or a Zoom, because that's where we understood analog and how we have to deal with analog. And then finally, we talked about a blog channel because it's one way. Okay, blog channel, book, radio, a movie, right? A recorded video like a Loom video. And so when we're using these channels, we can think about these properties, both for processing and for what do we do about communication. So that would be a solid foundation of a communication course, is to say, okay, well, here's what you're going to get. Let's trade off these channels. And to communicate effectively, you want to select the proper channel. So keep that in mind as well. So that's the review. So I think that this will help you develop a process. At least you got the skeleton of a process for handling any information channel. Open it, empty it, close it. Okay. And then deal with it. Right. And so then we've got some nuances about that as well. So learning how to process information channels goes a long way towards helping you deal with incoming information, which is a very important part of your personal information management. And strong personal information management is the key to knowledge work. So learning how to process incoming information is a strong step, and you learn this and it'll help you do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.